Okay. I'm Lucienne Allen, and this is my mother, Sita Dimitroff Milchev.
Hello.
And we are going to talk about her memories of her grandfather, Ernest Bloch. And I'm going to start with sharing my screen and showing some photographs while she talks. And I'm going to get going with that first thing here. And there we go. So, Mom, what are your earliest memories of your grandfather?
I remember taking the Shasta Daylight with my mother up to Portland, and then we would take the bus down to Agate Beach, and grandfather would be waiting for us at the bus stop, and we'd walk down to the house. And the first thing we would do, of course, was greet grandmother in the house, and then we would take our suitcase up to where we were staying, which was in grandfather's studio. You walked up the stairs, it was above the garage. You walked up the stairs, and there was this gorgeous room with a grand piano and the most marvelous smells of tobacco from his pipes. And then in the back, there was a room full of books that were mainly comical and just joke books. He loved those kind of books. And then 2 beds and a bathroom, and that's where we stayed. So my earliest remembrance of him is him meeting us at the bus stop.
How close were you to your grandfather?
Ernest Bloch was the only grandfather I knew, since my father's father had passed away before I was born. And he was just a man in the family. He was my mother's father, and that's how we knew him.
What was he like?
He was a very warm man. When I was there, they spoke mostly French, and it was wonderful to sit at the table and listen to him. He was always telling a joke. He had this marvelous twinkle in his eye, and he would smile. He would make me grenadine and soda drinks while everybody else had a regular drink. But he was very warm when you were with him.
Did you go on walking on the beach with him?
Yes, when we would take walks, the first thing that I remember about the Agate Beach house was when you walked by the kitchen door, they had these huge cabbage roses, pink cabbage roses, and the smell of the roses and the wet cypress as you were walking down to the beach was something I'll never forget. And to get down to the beach, there was this long ladder, and we had to go down the ladder to get to the beach. And grandfather always took a thermos of coffee and chocolate in his knapsack, and he always had his stick. And we would walk down the beach, and he would turn over rocks with his stick, looking for interesting agates. And in order for him to find the best ones, sometimes he had to pick up 3 or 4. And when he came back to the house, he would go into his beautiful desk in the living room, and he would place his agates. And the ones he didn't like, he tossed out the window. And from the living room window, if you went outside, there was a carpet of agates that he didn't like, but they were just stunning. They were just regular agates. They weren't polished yet.
And so he would polish agates?
Yes. In the garage, he had an agate polishing machine, which was just a machine that had a round metal thing in it. He would take sealing wax and put it on the agate, and then he would hold it and he would sharpen the agate itself. And as the glass left it, it made the most beautiful inside look of the agate. And he rarely would polish both sides, because he felt that one side showed who you were and the other side showed what you showed to the public.
So the shiny, glossy, performing side versus the
Yes.
rough agate that was the true man inside.
Yes.
Tell me about your grandmother, Marguerite.
Marguerite could cook. My goodness, that woman could cook. We went fishing once with my uncle Ivan, that was Bloch's oldest son, and nobody caught fish except me. And we took him back to the house. My grandmother had this incredible board that had a clasp on one side, and she would put the tail of the fish there, and she would rip off the skin of the fish, the scales, to cook. And the smell of fish cooking and butter was just permeated the whole kitchen. It was a wonderful smell. And she was an amazing woman. She also believed that when you are cleaning or taking care of water from dishes, what's that called?
Dishwashing?
Yeah, well, when you're dish drying, you always had to use linen on glass. She would get very upset if I used a different cloth because the linen didn't leave any little bits of cloth like the other stuff did. But she had a little pantry right off the kitchen. And in the pantry, when people would send them items of cookies or Swiss chocolate, that was all put in the pantry. And my cousin would go into the pantry when she visited, because she lived in near Portland and visited more often than I did. She would go into the pantry as soon as she got to grandmother's, and she would eat the chocolates. And my grandmother really didn't like that because my cousin never asked permission. So one day she got some dog biscuits and she filled up all those containers with dog biscuits. And the next time my cousin went in to get the chocolate, she had nothing but dog biscuits, and she came out and she was very irritated. My grandmother just smiled.
Tell me about the wine cellar.
The wine cellar. It was like you were going into Kansas. It was outside and you had to pull open a door and you go down these steps, and it was beautiful. It was all stone in there. And he had all his wines lined up. And he would ask me, what color would you like? Or what kind of wine should we have with dinner? And so it was always something that was red and bubbly. And it was like a rosé. And that was what we had, the wine at dinner was.
Do you recall the first time you heard your grandfather's music?
Grandfather's music was played pretty much all the time in the house. My mother would tell us this was written by your grandfather, but I had no concept of what that really meant until I got older and I got into music. But I listened to the radio all the time. We didn't have a TV for years. So it was mainly listening to the radio, or my parents would put on music, and we listened to all kinds of composers. But she always made sure that when grandfather's music came on, she identified him so that we would be able to listen and get comfortable with knowing what his music sounded like.
When did you first realize that he was the composer of the music, and what did that end up meaning to you?
I think probably more when I went to high school. When I was in high school, we had a wonderful choir director named Bob Greenwood, who has since passed, and he decided to have an evening of music. And he took the a cappella part of the sacred service and he taught us that. And then we did a section of Aaron Copland's Tender Land. And then we did another section with Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story. And that was the program for the evening. And it was very exciting. And that's the first time I realized that other people, especially parents of kids that I went to school with, were amazed that I was related to Bloch and that we were actually performing Bloch. And I had no connection until that time. Although the very first time that I heard a live concert with grandfather's music was at Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. And I think I must have been about 8 or 9, and my brothers were older than I am. And we were sitting in the auditorium there, and my brother Pencho fell asleep. And my mother was just mortified. And my grandfather said, "Isn't it wonderful that somebody can sleep to my music?" Because we know it's very hard to sleep in Choral music.
Did you like his music when you first heard it? Do you recall if you liked his music?
I recall that I thought that some of the things my mother liked, like the third and fourth quartet, were odd. They were more mature than what I was used to listening to. I could listen to America. I could listen to the Sacred Service. I could listen to the Concerto Grosso, especially Concerto Grosso No. 1, which was written for the students in Cleveland. they asked him, can you write something that doesn't sound so rough? And he said, of course I can. And he wrote the first Concerto Grosso, and that he was in Cleveland when he did that. And it's one of his more successful pieces because it's a little easier on the ear than a quartet.
Probably why it's my favorite piece. Can you tell me about growing up in Mill Valley, in the house next door to the shack where he composed his epic rhapsody, America?
Okay, when we first came to Mill Valley, we had left our home in Flint and packed everything up in the car, except for what was in storage. And then we drove across country.
How old were you?
I was almost 5. When we got to Mill Valley, Ada, Clement, and Lillian Hotchhead lived in this particular home, which was called the Shack. And they told us, we're probably going to be in the Sierras. This is a picture of Lil. They said that we're probably going to be in the Sierras. So when you come, just walk in, because the house is never locked, and make yourself at home. And so we were there maybe a day before they came back, and my brothers and I were playing cards in the basement. And all of a sudden this door opens up and Ada sticks her head in. She says, what are you doing in my house? And of course we were freaked, but she laughed. She was more serious than Lil was. Ada was more serious.
Who are, just so that everybody knows, who are Ada and Lil?
Ada Clement and Lillian Hodgehead started the Conservatory of Music in Lillian's...
In San Francisco.
In San Francisco, in Lillian's house. Her father allowed to have the space in her house used until it got to the point where there were many more students. And so when my grandfather came to San Francisco, he studied and he taught there at that house. It wasn't until I went to the conservatory in the 60s that it was in the old orphanage on Ortega Street in San Francisco. And that's where I attended the conservatory. Now it has a Bose Center. It's a huge place. It's gorgeous. We haven't been there yet, but it's a beautiful building. But what was the question?
Well, we were talking about Ada and Lil and living in Mill Valley next door to the Shack.
So my parents really loved the feeling of Mill Valley. And of course, where the Shack was, it was a house now. And it was lovely. And Lil said, there's a lady just up the hill a little bit from us. It was the only, the one close neighbor. And her name was Jessica Shaft. And she said, and she's the old librarian that we had at the conservatory. She's selling her house. She's divorcing her husband and she's leaving. She's going to Mexico. And so we all went up there to the house and it was stunning. And Jessica said, would you like to buy this house? And my parents said, sure. She said, okay. And her husband had left already. And she said, okay. She said, I'll send you my address in Mexico and send me $50 a month. And that's how we got that house. And in that house is where I listened to mostly my grandfather's music as well as others. But I was so close to Lil and Ada, and I would go down and take piano lessons from them. I wasn't very good, but I did my best. And it was quite an interesting time growing up there with being so close to so many good musicians. There was another musician who played piano right next door. Her name was Catherine Wood. She was very close to Lillian as well.
Did you caretake Lillian in her later days?
Yes, in her later days, which were when I was first going to the conservatory, which would have been in late 61. She was not feeling too well. So I stayed during the evening. I stayed at her house. I slept there. And then I borrowed her car and drove in during the day. And Catherine Wood came down. And I think there was another lady, until a woman who showed up and said she was Lil's cousin or related to her somehow. And this woman sort of took over. And that we didn't really see much of Lil after that. And then she passed away.
Do you recall any stories?
Yes, this is my grandfather, and he's with his favorite cat, Glee, and he's feeding Glee cheese at the table. And he did this every morning, And right now he's looking at my mother, of course, you can see he's about ready to go into a funny smile. But he loved his cats. They always had a cat named Zizi as well. But this is Glee. He was obviously a gray cat. And just beautiful. There were times when grandfather and I would walk on the beach. And once he said he was walking on the beach and he had his big cape to keep him warm. And these kids were walking on the beach and they came up to him and they said, "Are you the boogeyman?" He said, "No, I'm Ernest Bloch." And they had no idea what that was. But eventually they found their way to his house. His house was the only house that gave out an entire candy bar at Halloween. The kids loved that because it was a 5-cent candy bar. Those of you who remember when it was that cheap. And that was, there were kids who would come by. There were young composers who would come and they would knock on the door and they would introduce themselves. And grandfather always invited them in if he wasn't composing in his studio. So he didn't mind people coming to visit. But there weren't any paparazzi then either, so I guess that helped.
How old were you when he passed away?
I was about 15 when he passed away, and I was almost 16. He passed away in the summer, and my mother had gone up to Oregon with my dad, and she said, "We have to make a death mask of grandfather." Of her, she's obviously of her father. And she did that. She made a death mask, and it was not real easy because he was her father, but she knew that it was so important for the future. And she also did his hands. I believe we have some of those.
Yeah.
But it was quite moving when she brought them back.
In fact, there's still eyebrow hair on the mask. It's pretty incredible. Needs to go somewhere safe someday. I'm going to stop sharing this screen and we can talk about some other things before I share again. And so I'd like to start talking to you about your own musical career and when you first started singing.
I sang all the time, actually, with the radio. I just loved to sing. That was something that was good. My mother wanted me to learn another instrument. I wasn't very good at piano. I would kick the piano when I was practicing, and it was not very kind to it. But then she said, "Well, what instrument would you like to?" She said, "How about the cello? Grandfather wrote a great piece for cello." So I took up the cello and I played cello for a couple of years.
How tall are you? Let's let everyone know.
I'm 5'2".
How tall were you when you started playing the cello?
5 feet. And we rented this wonderful cello from Acoma Music in San Francisco. The fellow who ran that he was wonderful. He gave us a deal on everything. And so I played cello. I didn't like taking it on the bus. I had to take it on the bus to go to school, to practice with the small group we had there. So I decided I was going to give up cello. I took up the accordion for a while and then I put that down because I couldn't figure that one out either. And then I started singing, and I started singing because we would go to these special programs that the high school had. My brothers, especially my older brother, would always get an award, and they would have a program in the evening, and we all went, and the choir always sang, and I was just mesmerized by the choir and by Bob Greenwood, who was the man who directed it, who conducted it. And he was the music man, and we had a special place in high school called the band box, way up. It was the highest thing in Mill Valley. My high school was built on a hillside. And so it was quite interesting. It took us about 4 minutes to go from the gym all the way up to the band box. So obviously I wasn't going to carry a cello. and it was a beautiful chorus. And I was the first one in Mill Valley to sing the mother in A Mall and the Night Visitors. And after I sang that, I was asked to sing other things in the chorus. But the most wonderful thing about that chorus was Greenwood exposed us to all different kinds of music. And I think especially I played the mother in Copeland's Tender Land, which was quite an interesting piece. We had a lot of good singers in high school, and he just pushed us. He says, we're going to do this. We did Amelia Goes to the Ball. We did all kinds of wonderful shows that were fairly high quality compared to the other musicals. We also did things like Pajama Game, but mainly it was the more serious shows that we did that I enjoyed more.
What year did you graduate high school?
I graduated in 61.
And then what did you end up doing afterwards?
And I auditioned for the conservatory, and not knowing how to audition. And of course, my parents were of no help whatsoever. They were different kinds of artists. And I went in and I sang All That Gold from A Mile in the Night Visitors as one of my songs. Plus, I was also studying with Dr. Giulio Silva, who my grandfather had brought over from Italy. He said, and Silva he lived in Nevada, which was about 20 minutes away from Mill Valley. And I used to drive up to his place to take my singing lessons. And he was also teaching at the conservatory. And when I went to the when I auditioned, I was accepted, got a 2-year scholarship. And when I started there, we had very few students. I think the total we had when I was there was maybe 20. That was the full-time students. A lot of other students, but we're talking about the building is an old orphanage. And upstairs of this building, all these little rooms where the kids were, there was a sink and a piano. And it was fairly small, but it was wonderful because you could usually find a practice room to practice in and so on. And when I attended there, I was singing lots of German lieder and Italian 17th and 18th century, which was common for a beginning singer to learn at that time. And we had a very interesting director named Robin Laufer, who apparently Lillian had to go all over the world to find a new director of the conservatory. And this guy was a real crook. And every time you'd go into his office, he would have his penny collection set up on his desk. And he was just a very odd man, and he wasn't a very good musician. And we, as students, there were 5 of us, we didn't understand what he was doing there. And one of the students was told by a scholarship committee of the state of California, the accreditation people, he was told his scholarship wasn't picked up. And then another student who also was on scholarship, state scholarship, his money was not picked up. So we decided one evening we had to find out what this was all about. And we broke into the office there and we took pictures of the grades. The grades were not the grades that we received. They were the grades that they gave to the accreditation board. And there was this big stink about the conservatory not being accredited because of the way Laufer was running it. To make a long story short, I got kicked out because I showed him all of this. And we had a lawyer and we had all kinds of things. And we wanted also to be able to take a class from a man named Dr. Fred Fied, who came over from Cal. He taught us history and English because you had to have those things to be accredited in California. And Laufer didn't like Fiad because Fiad was really a smart man. And it was also during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so all of this is going on and we're students and we're excited about history, but we're supposed to be learning about music. And so anyway, I got kicked out and I was told, my mother said, let's go and talk to Laufer. And he said, well, if you write me a letter that says that you apologize. And he was telling me, and so I listed everything. I went home and I typed out this letter and said, this is what I think. And he said, now you have to post it on the bulletin board. And I posted it on the bulletin board. And he said, no, I don't want you to say what I wanted you to say. So I had put down everything that he had wanted me to say, and he didn't like that. We had Pinkerton guards with guns in a music school. And the news call bulletin took a picture of me. I was leaving with all my music books. And here's this Pinkerton guard with a gun who's standing there like this, looking at me as I'm leaving the front door. So, but that was also the same time of Mario Savio doing the free speech movement over at Cal. So Cal got a lot more attention than the conservatory. But we were all in that same timing of trying to figure out what life was about, as well as how to be a musician and how to get jobs and how to learn and how to talk to teachers and so on. And all the instructors that I had now have rooms named after them in the conservatory, which I find very interesting.
So the newspaper article stated, granddaughter of director Ernest Bloch kicked out of Conservatory of Music.
Yes.
So where did you go from there?
So then I kind of kicked around for a couple of weeks, and my mom said, what do you want to do? I said, I think I'll go to New York and I'll visit Aunt Susie. Maybe I'll attend Juilliard. And she kind of laughed. So
Aunt Susie is?
Aunt Susie is my mother's older sister. And she started the Lute Society in New York City and played the virginals and the recorders. And she did her ring. She always came through Marin County where we lived. So when I went to New York, I drove across country, and she was in Vermont at the time, but because she had a house up there, and she came down and she said, well, you know, you can't stay at my house because I teach. And she was a little bit afraid of me because I had gotten kicked out of the conservatory, and she didn't like that, you know, didn't stirring up trouble, stuff like that. So I stayed with a woman in Brooklyn Heights named Marie Duke, who was an activist. And Marie was great. And so I went into Juilliard, and it was up at 120th Street. It wasn't that great, big, gorgeous building it is now. It's across from Grant's tomb. And it was a very old building, and a wonderful guy who ran the elevator. And I went into audition, and I studied with a man called Emmanuel Balaban, who was quite interesting. And he gave me some beautiful music to learn. He said, I think this will be good for you when you go into audition. And my aunt, of course, was a little bit on the uneasy side. So when I went into audition, it was just a room that had like 6 or 8 people. I think it was 6 instructors, musicians there. They didn't know who I was. And Balaban he accompanied me, and I auditioned. And then they notified me later that apparently they put a yes or no into a box, and then they would read it. And if the majority said, yeah, we want that student to be with us, then they would let you know. Then they would look at who you were. And so I auditioned as Sita Dimitroff, which was a real positive for me. I didn't have the name Bloch. I just had the Bulgarian name of Dimitrov, and I was actually accepted, and I started. And Jenny Terrell was my instructor, and she and I, of course, fought a lot. And one day I got really irritated, and I said, how the hell did I get into this school anyway? And she said, anybody who sings a scale can get into this school. And of course, that wasn't true, but that's what she said. She and I were also auditioning for the same roles that would come up, and that was not a real positive thing for me to go through. But I was there for a couple of years.
Well, I was going to say, so did you have your Aunt Suzanne as a teacher? Because her Aunt Suzanne also taught at Juilliard. Yes.
No, I didn't have Aunt Suzanne as a teacher. She would have these little sayings she'd put up above the door. And she was mainly a sight singing teacher. And as you walk down the hallway, she would say, give me a perfect 4th from here. Or she would give you another note. She would catch her students constantly walking down the hallway, and she would say, okay, major 2nd, minor 2nd, perfect 5th. And the student had to do it. And that was a very good way to learn. And I was taking English diction from a good friend of my aunt's named Madeline Marshall, who wrote the definitive book on English diction. And I've used that book for all my singing throughout my entire career, because there's nothing like listening to a singer when you can't understand the words. And I hate that one, especially nowadays with a lot of the popular music. I can't understand any of the words. It's not important anymore. It's just the feeling that you get from most of these singers. But at the time, Madeline Marshall was quite a lady. She was a little tiny shrink of a lady, and she and my aunt hung out a lot together, and I learned a lot from her about music. I also took German diction and Italian diction, and I had to learn songs in each one of those classes And then I would perform them, and it was mainly for the diction. And in those classes, I would say there were no more than 15 or 16 kids. So it was a very nice, it was a nice small group of people. I think nowadays there's huge classes, but back in the 60s, they were fairly small, and it was good because you could converse with your fellow students, you could rehearse together, you could practice, and you could learn. And I was always looking for a pianist to play for me when I was trying to get some exciting rehearsal time in.
Okay, so how did you end up singing music? Where did your music go? How did you end up singing music that was so different than your grandfather's, or different maybe from what you were learning at Juilliard? What did you end up loving?
Well, I love all kinds of music, but I kind of found myself meeting a friend of my dad's who worked for him named Sam Charters when I was in New York. And Sam said, he said, can you sing blues? I said, probably. What is it you want me to sing? So he would play these old 78 records. And he said, I work for Prestige and I have to get a record out. He said, a folk music record. And he said, let's meet at Washington Square. And we walked around Washington Square, and all these kids are around the square. It's actually a round and not necessarily a square. And it had like concrete benches all around it. And all these kids are there and they're playing. And we met a young fellow named Artie Trum and Danny Kalb. And those are two musicians that Sam had run into. And he said, would you guys like to make a record with us? And they said, sure. And we found a couple other people. There was a fellow who played a fiddle, and Sam played kazoo and also washboard. And Sam's wife, Annie, played washboard as well. She was an expert washboard player, but she also was a very good pianist. She recorded in the auditorium at Columbia University. She recorded an album. And any of you have ever tried to play Joplin? No, it's not real easy. And she was just a magnificent musician. But we made this record. We all kind of got together at Sam's once to go through the music. We went into the studio, and it was one take on all the music, and that was it. And we got paid. We all got 5 albums. That was our payment. And the names were very funny. Sam couldn't use real names of some of the people. He had to use fake names, and he did. Danny Kalb's name is not on the album, and Artie Trum's is. But Artie has gone on to write all kinds of amazing study books.
Okay, I'm going to play a little something for everyone. This is my mother, circa 1963.
Probably.
Did you ever wake up when your man had gone? Turn over on your side and sing this lonesome song. I woke up this morning between midnight and day. You ought to see me grab the pillow where my man used to lay. Crying, hey, hey, ain't got no daddy now. If my country go to war, don't need no man no how. I'm singing this song for women just like myself. Running wild about your man when he's thinking about something else.
So
Thank you.
what has your grandfather's music come to mean to you personally?
Well, that's really hard. He was my grandfather. And although he was a composer, and I saw where he composed, and I would peek to see the music that he would write on the piano, he wrote so cleanly that you could probably print off of what his original was. He just was very finite in his thinking and very exact, so that when he composed, you could hear him hum. Because I would sit on the stairs below. There wasn't a door that closed off the entire studio. So I would sit on the stairs and listen to him, and he would play these chords, and then he would write something and he'd play some more. And it was when he was writing 2 last poems, and maybe, and that was what I listened to. when he was composing.
So did your grandfather hear you sing?
I sang only once for him. And that was just, I mean, I played piano for him a couple of times, and my grandmother in the kitchen would go, because I would make mistakes, but I didn't care. I wanted to play an enfantine for him. My mother wasn't too angry about it, because she wasn't really a musician. She could enjoy music really, really well. She was an enjoyer of all kinds of music, but she encouraged me. She said, go ahead and play for him. He won't mind. And he thought it was cute. The fact that I actually made the effort, and I was the only grandchild who went on to professionally be a musician. My oldest brother played oboe, and he was in various symphonies all around Washington state. My other brother played Pencho played trumpet, but he just couldn't get the hang of learning how to read music, so he stopped playing. I was the only one that carried it on. My cousins had no interest at all in music.
How often have you performed his music, and what's your opinion of those pieces as a vocalist?
Well, he didn't write a whole lot for voice. He wrote the Histoire des Crépuscules, which is a group of songs, and I managed to learn 3 of them, but I couldn't learn the 4th. His music is very, very difficult, and it's very difficult because it has range. He goes from very low to very high. I happen to enjoy singing the soprano or alto solos in the sacred service. I did that all over the place. And I loved to sing those.
Pull his foot back there.
I loved to sing those solos.
Sorry. I just interrupted her because there was something going on down below here. But okay, so there's something that she did in 2008, sorry, and it was called the Songs of Life International Choral Festival, which was a one-of-a-kind Thanksgiving festival to the Bulgarian people, commemorating 65 years after the heroic and compassionate rescue of all 49,000 Bulgarian Jews during the Holocaust. This festival brought together the US, Canada, Bulgaria, and Israel for the important purpose of performing Ernest Bloch's sacred service in Sofia and Plovdiv, Bulgaria, and in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, Israel. And I'm going to share the screen again. I have a little bit that you can hear. Before I'll let you know, there's a little interview with her, and she did not know that they were going to be interviewing her.
No, we had just had a very horrendous rehearsal. And as we're all leaving, I mean, this is a 2.5-hour rehearsal. As we're all leaving, they said, wait a second, we want to talk to you. And I had no idea what they had in mind. And so I was hot and sweaty, and they interviewed me. I didn't even know that it was going to be part of the video when they finally put it out.
Let's get this.
The organizers and participants of the festival were honored to have Mrs. Sita Milchev, granddaughter of the composer Ernest Bloch, as a participating singer and guest of the festival.
The Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco commissioned this work, and grandfather was the director of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music from 1925 to 1930, and in the late 30s, Cantor Rinder from Temple Emmanuel commissioned him to write the sacred service. He went to Roveredo, which is the Italian part of Switzerland, and he wrote this piece. He was not a practicing Jew, so he had to learn Hebrew completely. And he went through the Reform book, and he learned everything that he possibly could about the services, the Reform service. And this was one of his most favorite works. And I performed this work many times, and he only heard me sing once. He never heard me sing this piece, but he really enjoyed meeting Cantor Rinder and with the Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco.
In their